Everyone, welcome to another episode of Live with NORML. I'm JM Pedini, the Development Director for the National Organization for the Reform of Marijuana Laws. It's Tuesday, September 10th, 2024, and today we're doing a special episode of Live with NORML dedicated entirely to answering your burning questions and demystifying the federal marijuana rescheduling discussion that is underway right now. Hey, Woodyard, good to see you. Welcome back. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Take a quick second to hit that like, follow, or subscribe button wherever you're watching so you never miss when NORML goes live. Hey, while you're at it, why is it not live on Instagram? Well, we're gonna, bear with us while we try to get this back live on Instagram as well. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments. And you'll let us know soon on Instagram as well. We have, oh, it says I am live. I think it's wrong. We'll just fix that real quick. Like, there we go. We have a special guest with us today. I hope this, whatever, we'll see. I don't know what's happening on Instagram. There we go. Hey, Paul, why don't you join us? All right, there we go. Friends, I'm doing it. I know it's not Friday, and then the Instagrams were broken. We're doing great. But hey, Rusty, thank you for joining us as well. While everyone is dropping their burning questions in the comments for us and letting us know where they're watching from, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself again to our audience and give them a little rundown about what we're going to talk about today.
Sure. Well, as the convenient tag under my chin says, I'm NORML's Deputy Director. I've been working professionally in cannabis policy reform going on 3 decades. And today we're going to answer people's questions as it pertains to the cannabis scheduling administrative petition that remains ongoing. And in particular, we're going to talk about some of the next steps that are going to take place now that DEA Administrator Ann Milgram has made it official that there will be administrative law hearings to further discuss and debate the proposed rule to move cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3. For those who may not know, there have actually been ALJ hearings on this issue in the past. NORML petitioned to move cannabis out of Schedule 1 all the way back in 1972. And after years of litigation in 1986, the DEA at that time did agree to administrative hearings, and those hearings took place over the course of a couple of years. So this isn't our first rodeo when it comes to this issue. Folks like me anticipated that there were going to be hearings, so this isn't a surprise. But again, we're happy to speak with all of you and answer questions you folks may have about what's coming next and what some of our strategy intends to be to continue to move this process forward.
Fantastic. Thanks for a little bit of a history lesson there on the previous petitions, Paul. I think some people may have questions about those as well. Hi, William. Thanks for joining us. Hey, Brian. Good to see you. One of our Instagram followers says, "What's taking so long? Hurry it up."
Yeah, that I get it. But, you know, I got to tell you, this is a process that was set in motion in 1970 It's an administrative process, and it's not meant to be expeditious, for better or worse. This is a process that is meant to take a long time, that has a number of different hurdles that can delay it, actually in many cases to a much greater degree than it's been delayed thus far. Of the 5 previous petitions that have been filed to reclassify marijuana, this particular petition is moving faster than any other one ever has historically. And again, to give people some context, NORML filed a petition in 1972 that was not resolved until 1994. That process took over a decade. There were other petitions that filed more recently, the most recent being in 2011. That was not resolved until 2016. So that process took 5 years. Right now, we're just shy of 2 years into this process. And I am hopeful it will be resolved one way or the other within, ideally, the next few months. But that's not certain. This process can drag out quite a bit, particularly if there is additional litigation, and that very well could be the case.
In fact, some opponents to this issue have hinted at the fact that they would like to litigate the issue.
Yes, and let's be clear, when I say litigate the issue, what I mean is that after the ALJ hearings conclude, after a DEA judge has rendered a decision, and after the agency itself has either accepted or rejected that judge's decision, then after that process is completed, that is when litigation can take place. When a party who ultimately opposes the decision that is made by the agency, if they want to file litigation, at that point they can, and that litigation could then drag out for quite some time. But we are still fairly far away from a time when the DEA is going to make its ultimate decision. And that's one thing I think people need to be aware of. Yes, there's going to be ALJ hearings. Yes, there's going to be a DEA judge that is going to hear testimony from experts and proponents and opponents. And that judge will render a decision. But that's not the end of the process. The DEA itself, the agency, has to then make a determination of whether or not they're going to accept that decision or set that decision aside. And when NORML filed its petition in 1972, and we had administrative law hearings in 1986, we did not get a ruling from the DEA in those hearings until 1988. And the ruling was in NORML's favor. The judge in 1988 said proponents had made their case to DEA, to that judge, that marijuana didn't belong in Schedule 1. And then it was 2 years after that judge's decision that the DEA itself set aside that ruling and simply said it's not binding, we're not going to follow it. And then there were 4 additional years of litigation trying to compel, or to get a court to compel the DEA to abide by the decision of its own judge. And in 1994, the Court of Appeals for Washington, D.C. said DEA didn't have to. It could just ignore the decision from its judge from ALJ hearings. And that's what happened. So again, we are still in phase 3 or 4 of an ongoing process that still has many phases left to it.
Paul, I can see in our comments we have Brian Adams. That's not the one I wanted to show you, but we will look at that one next. We have Brian Adams, who says, I teach about the history of rescheduling in my history of cannabis course at the Cleveland School of Cannabis. Brian was excited to hear you mention Francis Young. And Brian, I did drop a link to NORML's white paper, A Brief History of Cannabis Rescheduling Petitions in the United States. It's one of our fact sheets that you can check out on the NORML website. And I hope maybe you and or your students find that useful as well. Look, Pop Brothers at Law, thanks for joining us. And they asked the question that I think is on so many of our viewers' minds. Do we really think federal legalization is going to happen?
Yeah, so to me, that's such a loaded question because first we have to define what we even mean by federal legalization. I think when you throw that term out, most people presume we're talking about a policy where marijuana instantly becomes legal in all 50 states. Um, Such a policy has never been proposed at the federal level, nor would I foresee such a policy being proposed. We live in a federalist republic. The federal government is not going to wave a magic wand and demand states like Alabama and Utah legalize marijuana. At best, what the federal government is going to do is enact legislation that takes the federal government out of the marijuana law enforcement business, very much like it did with the repeal of alcohol prohibition nearly a century ago, and allow states to make their own decisions. And certainly there have been a number of pieces of legislation, including legislation that's passed the House of Representatives twice to essentially take the federal government out of the marijuana equation. But the only way we're going to have a policy like that in the United States is going to be when a majority of representatives in the House and a majority of representatives in the Senate agree on that legislation and send it to a president who will sign it. And we're still a long way from that day.
Yeah, it's almost like elections have consequences or something like that.
Yeah. You know, JM, you've said it best that if voters vote for politicians who oppose marijuana policy reform, don't be surprised when you don't get marijuana policy reform. And that has certainly been the story, certainly at the federal level in many cases, and definitely in certain states, like a state like Texas comes to mind. We'll hear time and time again, why doesn't marijuana policy reform gain traction in Texas? Well, just look at the legislature and look at their public positions on this. It's not a mystery.
Yeah, garbage in, garbage out. If you elect people who are terrible on cannabis policy, you can expect to get terrible cannabis policies. Now, we have a big election coming up in November, and the good news is NORML's got your back on that. Before you head to the polls, take a quick look at Smoke the Vote, our voter guide, so you know where the candidates stand on cannabis policy before you cast your vote for them. You can find that at vote.normal.org. Super important that you know before you vote. All right, let's take a look at some of these other comments. Okay. Hey, Rusty has a question. Rusty says, what are the odds that full legalization overtakes rescheduling?
Yeah, I mean, to me, they're on two entirely different tracks. So right now, the rescheduling track is the one that's moving because there is a process that is undergoing. And right now, there is no movement in Congress when it comes to legislation that would, again, repeal federal marijuana prohibition. So we would have to be looking at least ahead until the next congressional session for these bills to be reintroduced. And then we'd have to look at the makeup of the House and Senate, in particular, leadership at of both chambers, leadership of key committees like the Judicial Committee, and see if there's really a viable path forward.
You know, Ben is watching on Instagram, and Ben very smartly says, end federal cannabis prohibition by an act of Congress, because that is, as we've said time and time again, what it's going to take. And I know we've both heard from people who think that this is an either or scenario, like, you know, rescheduling is the proposal that is before us right now. And a lot of people are understandably disappointed that this isn't descheduling, and think that this is the time to, you know, demand one versus the other, when in fact they are two different tracks, and it's still an either or.
Yeah. They're two different tracks. And again, we're talking about two entirely different processes. When we talk about descheduling, that is something that needs to be done by Congress. And we're talking about the bureaucratic action of moving the placement of cannabis from one schedule to another. That can be done through the petition process. Congress, of course, could do it as well. But the very fact we're having this conversation 54 years after Congress initially categorized marijuana as a Schedule I controlled substance makes it relatively clear that members of Congress do not have an appetite for addressing this issue. Again, that is why this is now the sixth administrative petition to deal with this issue. Because again, Congress has made it clear they're not willing to deal with the issue. Now, in recent years, again, as I mentioned, the House of Representatives has made it clear that they are willing to discuss and even pass legislation to repeal marijuana prohibition. The House has done it twice. The Senate has never taken up the issue.
Paul, we have a really excellent comment and question from Certified DJ on Instagram. I don't want to forget that one, but I want to bring up this one from Chris real quick, and then we'll do Certified's question. Chris says, when do you think DEA will have a final hearing? Do you think it depends on who wins the election?
So the administrator for the DEA has announced the hearing date, or when the hearings will commence, and that is Monday, December 2nd. Now, it is possible that parties could file legal motions to push that date back. Now, the only real scenario I foresee why that could potentially happen is that right now there is a 30-day window with which, according to the DEA, or who the DEA defines as aggrieved parties, can petition the agency to be participants in these hearings. And as you can imagine, a lot of folks who support reclassifying cannabis and opponents who want it to stay in Schedule I are making their pitches as to why they are interested or aggrieved parties and should be at this hearing. It's possible. Obviously, the DEA is not going to select all of these folks to participate. It's possible they might select very few. They might select nobody. But I could foresee a scenario where a group that petitions to be a party to these hearings and is denied then tries to litigate the matter and say that they were inappropriately denied and they have a right to be there. And if that happens, that could push the commencement of the hearings later than December 2nd. But presuming they actually do begin on December 2nd, those hearings could go on for a matter of days. They could go on for a matter of months. But they will, again, begin at that point in time unless there's litigation between now and then. And I would expect after the conclusion of those hearings, the judge presiding over them probably not to take longer than 1 or 2 months to render a decision. Then we have to wait for the agency to either accept or set aside that decision. And that could, there's really no timeline on when that could be. So we are realistically, in my mind, we're probably awaiting some sort of final resolution until the middle of next year, hopefully. And then, like I said, then there is another window of time after that final decision by the DEA is made where individuals can file additional litigation opposing that decision.
Wow. Let's tackle this question. Now, I can't show the Instagram comments on the screen. It doesn't give us that functionality, but I can read them to you. So here we go. Certified asks this question. Will rescheduling force social equity dispensary owners in New Jersey to sell their ownership, as with Schedule III, felons cannot own dispensaries? There's speculation with rescheduling that a pharmacist will be required to be in grow and retail?
So let me say this. It is not definitive what the real world result would be of reclassifying cannabis from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, simply because we have no pre-existing example of a Schedule 3 substance that is not FDA approved. Okay? So right now, every substance that is either Schedule 2, 3, 4, or 5 has received FDA approval. It's gone through the clinical trial process, it's gone through the FDA review process, and the FDA has deemed that that substance is safe and effective for treatment for a particular condition. Okay? It has been made very clear throughout this process, and if you read the White House legal opinion on HHS's recommendation to move marijuana from 1 to 3, they say this recommendation should not be conflated with FDA approval. So I understand that there are a whole number of regulations in place for how FDA approved substances in Schedule 3 are regulated. But cannabis is not going to be an FDA approved substance, even if this decision is abided by to move it to Schedule 3. So I don't think because of that, you're going to see any real demonstrable change in the way these state licensed businesses are operating. Right now, they're operating out of compliance with the rules and regulation that govern Schedule 1 substances. Moving forward, they'll largely be out of compliance with rules and regulations that govern Schedule 3 substances, but we've seen that is not the position of the federal government to intervene on these issues with regard to these state license operators, and I don't think that's going to change. And again, we should not conflate this move to Schedule 3 with equating that with the FDA has now said marijuana is a medicine and ought to be treated like other Schedule 3 FDA approved medicines. We're not going to see marijuana in pharmacies if this change in scheduling goes through, because again, the FDA has not determined that marijuana is a medicine in the traditional sense of an FDA approved therapeutic agent.
I hope that clarified it for you. Certified. Let us know in the comments if you have more questions about that. Take a quick look and see who else has some comments. Thanks to everyone who just joined us on Instagram. Hi to Kelly and Samuel and Colorado, Mama and Tony, and everyone who's giving us these great comments. Side note, Paul, you may recall that in Cherokee in North Carolina, they began adult use sales
on Saturday, yes.
And we were all very interested to see what would happen if law enforcement might be waiting when people left the reservation. And Samuel is there and is letting us know that that didn't seem to be the case. So that's good to hear. Thanks for keeping us posted on that.
It's really indicative of how much times have changed. You know, I've been doing this long enough to recall when certain tribal leaders in different states simply wanted to engage in growing hemp. And we're talking about hemp in the most traditional sense here on tribal lands, and the federal government shut them down. And to see now we're at a point where we have tribal leaders literally defying the federal government and the laws of their own state, selling adult use cannabis products, and thus far doing so without repercussion from either state, local, or federal officials, again, speaks, I think, to the reality that even in jurisdictions where the laws have not caught up with public opinion, that there's an understanding from law enforcement and others that it would be so unpopular to use limited resources to go after these folks that they're simply willing to look the other way.
Yep. I'm so glad to, because it could have been an absolute nightmare for consumers looking to take advantage of this in that area of the state, and unfortunately, that doesn't seem to be the case right now. Brian has another great comment here, Paul. I think you'll like this one. Brian adds, cannabis does not even fit into the 5 criteria that categorize scheduled drugs. Alcohol and tobacco are better suited for Schedule 1, but they are conveniently unscheduled.
Yeah, absolutely. Brian's right. And if anyone wants to read NORML's public comments that we submitted to DEA, we make the point that while we agree with HHS's determination that the science does not support the idea of marijuana being in Schedule 1, that we don't believe that marijuana has a high potential for abuse, and that we certainly do believe marijuana has legitimate therapeutic value, we also make the point that it really doesn't fit the criteria of a Schedule 2, Schedule 3, Schedule 4, or Schedule 5 substance. And it needs to be removed from the CSA altogether. That is really the only option that provides states the flexibility that they need to set their own cannabis policies. And again, this isn't a novel concept. The federal government understood this nearly a century ago when they repealed alcohol prohibition. Keep in mind, when the federal government got out of the alcohol control business, they did not mandate all 50 states legalize alcohol. The federal government simply got out of the way. There were many states that continued to impose alcohol prohibition for years after the federal government repealed it at the federal level. Conversely, there were several states that were defying the federal government during alcohol prohibition and were allowing for the sale of alcohol and daring the federal government to do something about it, very much like the situation is now. And when the federal government made their decision, they simply said, we're going to get out of the way. We're going to let states decide how they want to deal with alcohol. And again, that's why alcohol is not included in the 5 schedules. The schedules exist so that the federal government has a uniform set of regulations so that every state has to treat substances in those schedules the same way. That's why New Jersey can't treat oxycodone one way, but California can treat it another way, because the schedules demand that substances in these particular schedules must be treated by every state the same way. If we want to respect states' decisions to treat marijuana the way they see fit and acknowledge that other states may want to treat marijuana differently than that, then the only option to account for that is descheduling.
Hey, look, America, if Virginia can do it, so can you. Virginia happened to remove marijuana entirely from the Controlled Substances Act and simply defined it in code as, you guessed it, marijuana. Its own special set of rules. Ben has an interesting comment, and well, I'm sure he knows where the answer is going with this. I look forward to hearing your comments on this, Paul. Ben adds, where is the Schedule 3 final rule? If the administration supported this, the final rule would have been produced a long time ago. Is that accurate?
Unfortunately, that's not the way it works. This is a statutory process. It's a process that is laid out in the Controlled Substances Act that says when someone files a petition to reclassify marijuana, that first it must go before a review by the Department of Health and Human Services and the FDA. And then once the FDA completes their review, they then send their recommendations to the DEA. The DEA then conducts their own review. And then when the DEA completes that review, they send a notice of proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register. That then allows for the public comment period to begin when individuals can weigh in on the proposed rule. Then after that public comment period, there's the option for administrative law hearings, which the DEA recently announced they're going to hold. Then we have to have those hearings. Then a judge has to make a determination, and then the DEA has to sign off on that determination, and then parties have the opportunity to litigate that decision. This is a process that historically is taking many, many years, and it's a process that's designed to take many years. That's simply the law. And the administration doesn't have the ability to basically do an end run around that law. They initiated the petition process, and this is all part of the process.
Let's talk about your recent op-ed then, Paul, because you do make some very important points there, that the DEA's hearing is a good opportunity for advocates to make the case for rescheduling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I believe that's the case. Now, obviously, the DEA is going to have discretion on a number of things. They are going to have discretion with respect to who is allowed to participate, and they're going to have discretion with respect to what topics those participants can testify to. So the scope of this hearing could be very narrow, or it could be very broad. I think we have a pretty good idea on the topics that the DEA is going to accept testimony on. Because if you go back and read the proposed rule that came from DEA, they essentially said right in the text of it, we have certain concerns about public health issues that we don't think HHS, when they made this recommendation, delved into in great enough detail. They talk about concern over emergency room visits. They talk about psychosis and physical dependence. They talk about high THC products. Clearly, these are issues that, for better or worse, DEA is saying we want to hear more expert opinion and testimony on these issues because they concern us. I'm not surprised by any of that. Once again, we expected DEA to move forward with this issue. But keep in mind, for the DEA to render an opinion against the scientific consensus of HHS on this, they would have to make the case that marijuana possesses no accepted medical use in the United States. They would have to make the case that cannabis possesses not a high potential for abuse, but the highest potential of abuse of any controlled substance. That's why it's in Schedule 1. And they have to make the case that the potential risks associated with the use of cannabis are so significant that it couldn't even be safely administered within a controlled setting like a hospital. Those are the three criteria that are mandated of a controlled substance that's in Schedule 1. If even one of those criteria aren't met, by law, cannabis has to be classified somewhere else. So right now, we have a situation where HHS, the scientific arm of the federal government, reviewed the available literature and said cannabis doesn't meet those criteria. It's clearly a medicine, and while it may have some abuse potential, it doesn't have such high abuse potential that it meets the Schedule 1 criteria. The DEA is going to hear expert testimony in court. And these are statements of fact. I don't believe there's any witnesses out there that can persuasively make a case that undermines those obvious statements of fact that HHS affirmed, that FDA affirmed, that we all know to be true. That the reality is in 2024, 38 states regulate medical marijuana as a medicine. Some states have done so for 3 decades nearly. That almost 70% of practicing physicians in this country believe marijuana is a medicine. That more than 1 in 4 practicing physicians in this country have recommended cannabis to their patients. And that while cannabis may have some abuse potential, it's nowhere near the abuse potential associated with Schedule 1 substances like heroin or Schedule 2 substances like methamphetamine and fentanyl. So I think advocates are in a very good position to simply argue that the science is on our side and that HHS got it right. And it's the burden of our opponents to somehow try to make the case that HHS got it wrong. And again, I don't think they're going to be able to do that. If we go back in time nearly 40 years ago, when NORML was arguing this in administrative law hearings before the DEA, we were able to make the case then to the DEA that marijuana wasn't just a safe therapeutic agent, But in the words of their own judge, it was the safest, one of the safest therapeutically active substances known to man. Our case is exponentially stronger now than it was 4 decades ago. And we were able to make the case then. I certainly think we can make the case now.
Paul, since you mentioned it, and just as you were mentioning it, Tree also made a comment that I won't show because we don't say this name on our show, but one of our major opponents, Tree, is of the opinion that this major opponent will, in fact, try to argue, just as you were saying, that this case hasn't been proven. Do you think that's likely? And from this opponent, we've heard complaints about the deviation from the previous 5-factor test. 5-factor.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. Yeah, so I do think there are going to be arguments that are made by opponents if they have the opportunity. Again, remember, DEA has the discretion to determine who's going to participate and what they're going to be permitted to talk about. So if, for instance, the DEA judge says, I only want to hear testimony about abuse potential, I don't want to hear any testimony about international treaties, then nobody's going to be talking about international treaties, for instance. Now, I do think a judge probably will say, hey, I am interested in hearing why historically the DEA used a 5-factor test, and in this case, HHS used a 2-factor test, why they deviated from that process that had been used in the past. Now, HHS addresses this in their recommendations. They say this is why we did this way and not that way. Again, if you look at the legislative opinion on this, they lay out the case. But certainly it's something that could come up in court. As far as that person whose name we typically don't say, the narrow scope of who qualifies to be participants in the ALJ hearing is very clear. And so if you look at Ann Milgram's notice, she says the purpose of this hearing is to receive factual evidence and expert opinions. And the parties that are eligible to be considered to deliver that expert evidence and factual and facts are people that are adversely affected or aggrieved by the proposed rule. I'm not even convinced that organization meets that standard because I don't know how they can even possibly be an aggrieved party. They are not directly impacted in any way, nor are their members by any potential change in the scheduling of cannabis. Now, there certainly are aggrieved parties out there. State licensed businesses that right now can't take tax deductions because cannabis is Schedule 1, but would be able to if it's Schedule 3. Or would be able to advertise their products in a way if it's Schedule 3 that can't now. They can point to being an aggrieved party if this rule doesn't go through. But that particular organization can't. And I think that they're being overly presumptive if they just presume they're going to be a part of these hearings. I wouldn't make that presumption. They may not be part of them at all.
Fingers crossed, everyone. We had some comments about Nixon and whether or not the actions were unconstitutional. His actions were unconstitutional regarding scheduling. And then
Nixon did not schedule marijuana, Congress did.
And then Joshua offers this comment. Now that the Chevron doctrine has been overturned, the DEA's discretion could be challenged in court. Any thoughts about that?
So I'm certainly no expert in regulatory law. I've seen folks argue that maybe it could and maybe it couldn't. My limited understanding of the Chevron decision is that there in the past had been a deference to federal agencies setting regulations on matters where Congress's intent or the law was not already clear. And unfortunately, when it comes to the matter of scheduling and the process for reclassifying cannabis, this is statutory. It is clear. The Controlled Substances Act lays out the process of how this happens, and Congress has provided DEA with the explicit authority to have the final word on the subject. So I'm not sure there is a gray area that's open here for interpretation where one could argue the DEA is overstepping its bounds and it's establishing regulations that only Congress should be able to make decisions upon. Because Congress has shown that other than initially establishing the 5 categories and putting cannabis in Schedule 1, that they have no appetite for addressing this issue. And they have essentially provided that power to DEA. That's certainly historically how it's been. And I don't think there's a whole lot of debate that DEA is overstepping its bounds by making those decisions. Congress has essentially granted them the power to do so.
Speaking of Congress, I posted this a little bit earlier. I just shared it again in the comments. I realize on Instagram you're not able to get this link and click it there, but you can head right over to NORML's Take Action Center. The very top of the page, you will see our action alert. Tell the White House and Congress to support descheduling. So if you are passionate about descheduling, and I'm sure you are because you're here watching this show with us right now, now's a great time to send a message in support of that effort. And again, this is not an either or. We can both support the rescheduling process and advocate for more meaningful action from Congress, who is ultimately the responsible party when it comes to ending federal prohibition.
I would also say that if there's folks out there who think they meet the DEA criterion of aggrieved party and want to participate, that window closes in late September. But between now and then, you can send a letter to DEA that says, I'm an interested party in this matter. I'm an aggrieved party if this proposed rule doesn't go through, and I want a seat at the table.
Absolutely. I shared the link to the DEA notice of the hearing right here in the chat if you are looking for it. And you're watching us on Instagram or another platform, you're not able to see these comments. You can always go back and find them in the YouTube version of this stream. It'll be on NORML's YouTube. It's on NORML's Facebook, on NORML's LinkedIn, and our Twitter. It stays there. It doesn't go anywhere. It will disappear from Instagram when the stream is over, but you can still find this cataloged in our live library. I'm going to take a quick second to look through some more of these comments. Paul, I think we're getting, toward the end of the show. A few people have made some, we'll say, political comments in the chat, and I think it's worth noting that right now we have the 2 major party candidates in the presidential election both advocating for cannabis legalization.
Yeah, it's a fairly stunning development in just simply by the fact it's never happened before. We've never had an election where you have both the Republican Party candidate for president and the Democratic Party candidate for president both saying that they don't believe people should be arrested or go to jail for marijuana, and supporting changing the federal categorization of marijuana and changing federal marijuana laws. Now, with President Trump, we have to take this individual at his word because it's literally only been within the last few days that he's done an about face and started publicly talking about this issue and started publicly advocating for support of legalization at both the state level and at the federal level. I think that's arguably because he's recently brought people onto his team that have a fairly long track record of supporting this policy. Conversely, in Vice President Harris, we have somebody who, as a senator, put her name on legislation that would have repealed federal marijuana prohibition, and has certainly spoken about this issue for quite some time. Was part of the first administration to ever initiate reclassification of marijuana, and was part of the first administration to ever initiate mass pardons for people that have simple marijuana convictions at the federal level. So on the one hand, we have somebody who's talked about marijuana and has also acted in such a way to change marijuana policy, versus someone who very recently has started talking about changing marijuana policy, albeit in a very positive and forward-looking way.
Yeah, the comments are going crazy now with people having their opinions about both major party candidates and who would or wouldn't do what. But I think that who has done what matters in this instance.
Well, again, and we have to talk about the limitations of the executive branch, right?
Mm-hmm.
As we've talked about multiple times, Congress passes marijuana laws, all right? Congress is the branch of government that is going to have to repeal or amend those laws. As the president can take executive action. We saw President Biden do that, for instance, with issuing mass pardons. But the president is quite limited, or the office of the presidency is quite limited on what they can do. Ultimately, it is Congress that legislates, not the president. And until we have a Congress that consists of a majority of lawmakers who are willing to prioritize this issue and advance this issue and advance legislation to the desk of the president, whoever it may be, a lot of this conversation is just a lot of people blowing smoke, for lack of a better term, because it's irrelevant who's sitting in the White House if Congress won't send a bill to the president's desk to change marijuana policies.
Yeah, absolutely. And to some of the comments we've seen about this being a sort of last minute effort by the Biden administration, this rescheduling process has been underway for 2 years now.
Yes. Yeah, it was initially announced, I believe, in October of 2022.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, almost.
And it coincided with the first issuing of mass pardons, which again was the first time any administration had ever done that. And there's polling out there that shows that the American public favors this presidential pardon action more so than any other presidential pardon action that's ever taken place in our history, including going back to when previous administrations pardoned war resistors during Vietnam.
Yeah, Adam, watching on Instagram, I see your comments, and they are, first of all, hilarious. But second, he says blowing smoke equals politics. And yeah, that's exactly what it is. And we talk about that a lot on this show. It's one thing to make statements on the campaign trail or to have a position on a particular policy issue. It's another thing to be elected to office and decide how you're going to press that button on that vote. We see this a lot at the state level with candidates on the campaign trail who will say they support legalization or they support expungement or medical cannabis access. Then they get into office and they say, yeah, well, I didn't like that. I didn't like that version of the bill.
Yeah, I was going to say that's also a popular rhetorical piece, is to say, I support reforming marijuana laws, but I just don't support this bill or that bill or any bill that comes out there. And then they don't introduce their own bill, coincidentally. So
Exactly.
But I do think, JM, that the takeaway from all this, we really shouldn't be arguing over the hypothetical who, if they presume office, may or may not do more or less on this issue. But we have to recognize why both presidential candidates are talking about it now. And that's because they are in a dead heat in this election where every vote matters. And they recognize that speaking positively about marijuana policy reform in 2024 equals getting you votes. That's why they're doing this. Because when you look at swing states like Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or Michigan, and there's been recent polling done on this, the majority of voters in those states support legalization. They support reclassification. They support safer banking. They support expungement. They overwhelmingly support these issues. And those are the votes that candidate Harris and candidate Trump, they're looking at those voters and thinking those votes are up for grab. And they think that by speaking out on this issue or promoting the issue of marijuana policy reform gives them a better likelihood of gaining those votes. That's a seismic shift in even the past few years with respect to how major party candidates are addressing this issue.
Paul, this is definitely one of our, I think, most popular lives ever, at least during the live portion of the live. We've got 1,500 viewers right now, which is pretty great for Tuesday afternoon talking about federal policy. I want to mention some comments I'm seeing here. I'm not going to show them because they say the words that we don't say on this show. But the Cole Memo is a podcast. First of all, love that name. Second, what do we think the opposition thinks about this recent development? I mean, they've been big mad and have been throwing fundraising tantrums all over the internet, begging for money to help challenge, help present legal challenges against rescheduling. So yeah, that's the Cole Memo. That's what they've been doing. And the Cole Memo also goes on to say that they bet that this opposition loves that both presidential candidates support legalization. I'm sure they're just delighted by that. I'm sure they're extra delighted about the finally getting an actual on-the-record answer from Donald Trump about how he intends to vote on Amendment 3 in Florida. And I'm glad that we finally got that answer, because you'll recall, Paul, he had said some weeks ago that he intended to let people know fairly soon how he was going to vote, and then he didn't. He just sort of talked about the issue in general. And you wisely pointed out that he didn't actually answer the question.
No, at first he didn't, and now he did. He did go on record and say he was going to vote for Amendment 3. And, look, in Florida, to pass a constitutional amendment, you don't need 50% of the vote. You need 60%. That's a high bar. Yeah. And I do think there are people in Florida who are going to be influenced by the fact that the Republican candidate publicly said he supports Amendment 3. Look, we saw just today the young Republicans of Florida came out and also endorsed Amendment 3. Maybe they go ahead and do that anyway, but I find the timing of it pretty probably not coincidental that they did so just a few days after the Republican candidate basically made it safe for Republicans to say we support Amendment 3.
Yeah, absolutely. I can't see how that is coincidental. Well, yes, it's entirely likely that this was a position, at least internally, that a young group of voters would hold anyhow. They most certainly would be feeling that protection, that entitlement to say, hey, this is where we stand on this issue. And it looks like they're already taking some significant heat for that. But good for them for standing on the right side of history.
Yeah, absolutely. And believe me, I mean, for DeSantis to have doubled and tripled down in his opposition of this issue, I think it's definitely going to be costing him some standing among Florida voters, because his opposition looks silly, it's hyperbolic, and it's hard to say how seriously anyone's taking it at this point.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see tonight during the debate if this issue gets mentioned even once.
Yeah, normally, JM, I would say I don't expect it to, but I'm going to tune in tonight. I think the likelihood of it coming up is maybe about a coin flip, maybe 50-50. And, part of the reason I say that is because we know that former Hawaii Representative Tulsi Gabbard is now part of the Trump transition team, that supposedly she has been involved in prepping Donald Trump for this debate against Kamala Harris. And anybody who watched the Democratic primaries 4 years ago is well aware of what happened the last time Harris and um, Tulsi Gabbard faced off and talked about this issue. And so for that reason, I think that there may be some encouragement behind the scenes for Trump to potentially proactively bring this issue up. And frankly, I hope he does, because I'd like both candidates to further articulate their positions and their records on this issue. I think the voters have a right to know.
I do, as obviously, of course, we both want this, Paul. And speaking of records on this issue, something we see on this show a lot is people talking about Kamala Harris having been a prosecutor. And I think this would be a great time for you to clear the air, because
Sure.
I say it funny.
Sure. So
now, can you take one for the team? Go ahead.
Sure. So, NORML worked with Tulsi Gabbard when she was in office quite a bit, because she was an outspoken proponent of marijuana policy reform. She sponsored certain bills. That said, there were statements that she made that had during that primary debate that were not entirely accurate. Yes, it's true. Kamala Harris was the DA in San Francisco at a time when there was still a policy in California to prosecute large-scale marijuana traffickers. That office did not prosecute medical marijuana patients, and she maintained that policy. And then later, she was the Attorney General of California at a time when marijuana was not yet legal in California, but as Attorney General, she wasn't prosecuting anybody. The fact is that since the 1970s, marijuana possession or low-level marijuana possession was decriminalized. So no low-level marijuana offenders were being prosecuted by anybody in the state of California. And I believe during her time as DA, a total of 45 individuals received jail time for marijuana offenses. Again, not possession offenses, not low-level possession offenses, because those were not even criminal offenses in the state of California. And then by time 2016 came around, Harris at that point had become a much more outspoken and more evolved on this issue, as did most Californians and most of the American public. One of the things that I highlighted in another op-ed was that in 2010, Harris came out against a legalization initiative in California. But unfortunately, for those of us like myself who lived in California at the time, so did the majority of California voters. It was defeated. But then in 2016, a similar legalization initiative passed. And that's because over that period of time, a majority of Californians, like a majority of Americans, evolved on this issue and became supporters of legalization. Kamala Harris is no different. This is somebody who has evolved on this policy. That's not surprising. As I said, most Americans have, and she represented a state that evolved on marijuana policy, that legalized marijuana, and she was able to see the benefits of it. But this idea that she was some sort of hard-nosed DA that sentenced thousands of people to prison for low-level marijuana offenses is simply not true, because again, in the state of California, when she was DA and when she was AG, low-level marijuana offenses were decriminalized. They were not criminal offenses. They were not prosecutable offenses.
Thank you. I hope that clears it up for everyone. Yet, even as you were saying that, we still are seeing comments that are completely contradictory to, the fact of the matter that marijuana was decriminalized in California at that time.
We could add to the equation that I lived in California at that time and lived in the Bay Area. So she was my DA and she was my Attorney General. And this is obviously an issue I followed very closely. And for full disclosure, I did not vote for her to be a U.S. Senator. She was not my choice. So it's not like I have some long history of being a proponent of Kamala Harris. I didn't even vote for her.
Paul, someone asked me about my tattoos on Friday, and I felt momentarily like, is this too personal that I'm going to tell you what they are? But you've just disclosed your voting records, so I feel okay. Hey, thanks to everyone who has joined us. Someone on Instagram asked why it looks like only 8 people are watching. It's not. There's about 1,700 people watching. We stream across many platforms at once. So thank you for watching us wherever you are watching from. Please hit that like, follow, or subscribe button so you never miss when NORML goes live. We're so glad that this is a topic that is interesting for you. If there's another special topic that you'd like us to cover with a live episode, drop it in the comments. Let us know. Last week we had some people ask for a special live on, cannabis, the intersection of cannabis and gun policy. I should have said guns and weed, right, Paul? But I think that's particularly interesting. Let us know if that's something that you want to hear about, or if there's another special topic you want us to drag Paul or someone in here for. On Friday, NORML political director Morgan Fox will be joining me on that episode of Live with NORML, starting at 4 p.m. Eastern. It's Friday the 13th. And he will be talking about what's up with Congress, because they're heading back to work finally, and what we might expect out of them when it comes to cannabis. One last thing before we wrap up, Paul. What do you think the impact on the rescheduling conversation will be if Harris is elected or if Trump is elected?
I don't think it's going to change very much because, again, this is really, for better or worse, the DEA has the final say on this matter. And I think they're going to act largely independently of the administration. And in some respects, I think they almost have to, because if it is seen as if the administration is simply trying to bypass the process or put so much undue pressure to get a certain result, well, then you've just handed the reason for opponents of that result to litigate the issue, probably for the next 3 to 4 years. So again, I'm somewhat hopeful by the fact that President Trump recently implied his favoring of Schedule 3. That indicates that theoretically, regardless of who wins this election, we're going to have an administration that understands this process is ongoing and that would like to see it result in moving cannabis out of Schedule 1 for the first time in its 54-year history.
Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed for some continued momentum on this issue. Paul, thank you so much for joining us today.
Absolutely, JM. Pleasure to be here, and I like the opportunity to interact with NORML's members and other interested parties. So let's do it again.
Yeah, let's. Thanks so much, Paul. Everyone, thank you for joining us today. If you liked this episode, come hang out with us again on Friday. I'll be joined by NORML political director Morgan Fox, who will be talking about Congress getting back to work and what we might see in regards to cannabis policy from them. Hey, take a quick second to hit that like, follow, or subscribe button wherever you're watching so you never miss when NORML goes live. This has been a blast. Thank you so much for your questions. If we didn't get a chance to answer them, hey, come back and ask again on Friday, or you can send us an email at normal@normal.org. That's normal@normal.org. Yes, it's a real email address, and both Paul and I will in fact see it. So give us a shout out there. I agree, Ben. It is perfect timing, and let's mobilize. Let's make sure we are all getting ready to vote, to get out the vote, especially if you are in a state that has a pending ballot initiative. Make sure everyone you know and love in that state is ready to get to the polls, has made their plan to vote, and knows how to vote, not only on the issue, but for the candidates that will be on their ballots, on your ballots, when it comes to cannabis policy. NORML is here to help you be an informed cannabis voter. You can get all of the information you need at vote.norml.org when it comes to the candidates on your ballot. And if you'd like to take a look at the ballot initiatives that have qualified for 2024, you can see all of those details at norml.org/election. All right, everyone, this has been a blast. I'll see you back here next time. As always, thanks so much for watching. Bye-bye.